All right, so today we're going to be focusing on two different ways that you can get traits passed on. We're going to skip X-linked for today because we really we talked about them quite a bit. You had a homework assignment on X-linked traits. So today we're going to talk about autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive. So first of all, there's two different types of chromosomes in our bodies, in our cells. We have autosomes, which are your chromosomes paired number 1 through 22, and sex chromosomes. So those are the two different types of chromosomes that you have. So if we look at a picture of chromosomes here, the pairs 1 through 22 are what we call the autosomes. So this is pair number 1 through 22. So you have 22 pairs of autosomes. The last pair number 23, are your sex chromosomes. So today we're not going to be talking about the traits that lie on your sex chromosomes. We're going to be talking about the ones that lie on your autosomes. And all this means is that it's a trait that you would find on one of these pairs. So for instance, maybe autosome number 4 is where we have our hair color alleles. Maybe chromosome number 7 is where we can either roll our tongue or not. So we would find our alleles for tongue rolling on chromosome number 7. So all autosome means is that the trait is on one of those 22 pairs of chromosomes. So when we have a genetic trait or a disorder on one of those autosomes, we call it autosomal. That's where we get the term autosomal. If there's a genetic trait found on a sex chromosome, pair number 23, we call it sex-linked or X-linked. So I had told you this last week, most sex-linked traits are on the X chromosome. There are some found on the Y. We're not going to worry about those for this unit. But I do want to remind you again that males have what sex chromosomes? So if we look back at our picture up here, can you tell if this is a male or a female? How do you know it's a male? Because they have an X and a Y. Yep. So females are XX, right? So we would see 2 X chromosomes if this was a female. So just keep that in mind. And when we're doing an X-linked Punnett square, you do not write a superscript on that Y. Some people are doing that in the homework assignments. They're writing things on the Y. You don't do that, only on the X. All right, so like I said, we're not going to focus on X-linked today. We're going to talk about autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive. So we're going to start with autosomal recessive. So when there is an autosomal recessive trait, the person has to have 2 recessive alleles to show the trait. Okay, they need to have 2 small letters alleles to show the trait. So this means that both a person's pairs of autosomal chromosomes have the same recessive allele. They get one from their mom and one from their dad. So let's look at an example of this. So an example of an autosomal recessive trait is albinism, so being albino, which means you lack pigment in your hair, eyes, and skin. So let's take a look at an image showing a person with albinism. So if we're going to use the letter A to represent albinism, if somebody is big A, then they are normal pigment. If somebody is big A, they're also normal pigment. However, we would call them a carrier. And we call them a carrier because they're carrying that recessive allele, but they aren't showing the trait. Okay, they can pass it on to their offspring, but they're not showing the trait. And then the albino person's genotype is going to be little a, little a. So this fella in the middle would be little a, little a. His friends next to him are either homozygous dominant or they might be heterozygous. So a lot of times these are rare alleles, but if you're in a community where there's people with albinism, there might be a few people that are carriers that just don't know it yet. So you really can't tell whether somebody is a carrier or not until they have a child with albinism. And then you're like, oh, I'm a carrier and so is my partner. So the people that don't have it are either homozygous dominant or they're carriers. All right, this also happens in animals. So maybe you've seen an albino animal before. A lot of times they have what look like pink eyes, like a true albino has pink eyes. And the reason their eyes are pink is because they have no pigment in their eyes. So what you're seeing is the blood vessels behind their eyes. That's what makes them look pink. So you can have a pink, or an albino squirrel. I have an albino, I think this is an alligator or a crocodile. There's an albino giraffe on here. So again, what in the world is that? Uh-oh, how do I get rid of that thing? What was that? Okay, sorry. So in order to be an albino, you have to have the two recessive alleles. Heterozygous is a carrier. Homozygous dominant is not a carrier and is also normal. So you have to have two copies of the recessive gene. So you got one from your mom and one from your dad. And just a little side note is albinos have normal brain function, like they don't have any kind of learning disabilities. Their biggest struggles are with sunlight. So they can get sunburned really easily and their eyes can be really sensitive to light and sometimes their eyes don't develop. So they have vision problems as well. But otherwise they're normal in every other sense. So if a baby gets the disorder, they got it from both their mom and their dad because they have to get a recessive allele from dad and a recessive from mom. All right, so let's look at the other kind, the autosomal dominant trait. Okay, so this one is the opposite. For autosomal dominant trait, you only need one dominant allele and you have the trait. Okay, so only one pair of your autosomal chromosomes need to have the dominant allele. So you get it from either your mom or your dad, or maybe both, because if you're homozygous dominant, then you also have the disorder or the trait. So an example of this is dwarfism. So the definition of being a dwarf is being extremely short, so less than 4'10" is the definition at adulthood. And so let's take a look at how this is different than autosomal recessive. So first thing is you only need one dominant allele and you have the disorder. So there's no carriers. And there's no carriers because by definition, carrier means you're carrying the allele, but you don't have the trait. But the heterozygous individual has the disorder or the trait. So there are no carriers in autosomal dominant. And if you are homozygous recessive, then you are normal. Okay, so just looking around the room, I can see that I don't have any students in here who are of short stature. So everybody here is homozygous recessive. With autosomal dominant traits, you can tell that somebody is carrying the trait if they have the disorder or the trait. They're showing it in their phenotype. By the way, two dwarfs can have a normal sized child. If they're both heterozygous, if you do a Punnett square, they can have a child who's normal height. So you can cross two heterozygous dwarfs and they can have a normal heighted child. And it's happened. All right, so let's do two Punnett squares that show how these two things are passed. First, let's start with an autosomal dominant trait. Okay, so the one I just went over. And then we're going to use the example of dwarfism. So another word for this is achondroplasia, but another, we call it dwarfism. People that are dwarfs that have dwarfism don't like being called dwarfs. They like to be called person of short stature or little person. So again, there's no carrier. You either have the disorder or you don't. So if these are our parents here, and this is dad, because I've added his sperm cells, and this is mom over here. Can you fill in the Punnett square and answer some questions about their potential offspring? So go ahead and fill this in. All the rules that applied from the first time we taught Punnett squares still apply. All right, so what are the chances then of this couple having a child who is a dwarf? What was it? 50%, right? We have there's 2 out of 4 that could have dwarfism, right? And remember, it's the ones that have the dominant D, the big uppercase D. So what are the genotypes of the parents? I'm gonna do mom and dad. What is mom's genotype? What alleles does mom have? Nobody knows what mom's genotype is? She's right here. These are her eggs. Yeah, so mom is little d, little d. She can pass on a little d or a little d because her genotype is homozygous recessive. What is dad's genotype then? Thanks, Ethan. He is heterozygous, right? These are dad's sperm up here. If you combine them together, you get dad's genotype. All right, what is mom's phenotype? Is she normal or is she a dwarf? Yep, thanks, Faith. She is normal. She's normal heighted. And dad having the little d or the big D makes him what? It means that he's dwarf. So you have to remember what these words mean, genotype and phenotype. I think some people are still struggling with those two terms. Either that or just everybody's really tired right now, which I get, but I hope that in your head you're answering these questions. So what is the genotype ratio of this cross? This is a tough one because there's a 0 involved. Ryan is shaking his head. He's saying, no, it's not, Ms. Klepper. So easy. So what is the genotype ratio, Ryan? 0 to 2 to 2. So there are 0 big D babies. There are 2 heterozygous babies, and there's 2 homozygous recessive. Good. All right, how about phenotype ratio? Dwarf to normal. A little worried that my computer is going to die. Thank you, Faith. 2 to 2, right? 2 are showing the dwarf dominant trait, and 2 are showing the normal recessive trait. All right, now your brains have to flip back to autosomal recessive for the next one. So now we're looking at albinism. So just as a reminder, that means that big A is normal. The heterozygous is normal, but we call them a carrier. And little a is albino, lacking pigment. All right, so this reading here, you can, if you're interested in learning more about albinism, it talks about what it is and where it's found. So it's actually found on chromosome number 11. And just so you know, like if we were to look at chromosome number, like a picture of chromosome number 11 here, we can't see the albinism trait. Like you can't just look at a picture of somebody's chromosomes and go, oh, yep, they have little a, they're definitely albino. You can't tell that from looking at the chromosomes because what that little a is the sequence of DNA letters, A's, T's, C's, and G's that code for albinism. So you can't see it in a picture, but what it means is that it resides, those letters reside on the number 11 chromosome. All right, so let's go back and figure out what a cross between 2 parents that are both heterozygous. So cross 2 parents that are heterozygous. And we're going to use A's for albinism. And really nothing has changed since we started filling in Punnett squares. The only thing that's different now is you need to be able to tell who of these offspring would be albino or not. So knowing that this is autosomal recessive, you should be able to answer questions about these offspring. So for instance, what are the chances that these parents will have an albino child? Yeah, 25%. So both parents were normal pigmented. They both look normal. And all of a sudden they give birth to a baby who's albino. Now they can say, oh my gosh, I'm a carrier because I had a baby that's albino. So a lot of times people don't know that they're carrying these recessive alleles until they've given birth to a child that has the disorder. All right, what are the chances that they're going to have a child who's a carrier? Yeah, so 50%, the 2 heterozygous. And then what would be the genotype ratio of this cross? This one doesn't have any zeros in it, so we have all 3 genotypes. Nice, good job, Faith and Ethan. 1 to 2 to 1. So we have one big A, 2 heterozygous, and 1 little a. All right, what would be the phenotype ratio of this cross? How many would be normal to how many are albino? Yep, 3 to 1. So we'd have 3 normal babies to 1 albino. All right, what were the genotypes of the parents? So remember, this is asking for what alleles did the parents have? Yep, so they're both heterozygous. And then what is their height, not height, what is their pigment color? What's their phenotype? Are they albino, mom and dad? If they have the big A, that means that they are both normal. All right, and the last question was just from that reading. Which chromosome would you find albinism on? And that was mentioned up here in the reading that it would be on chromosome number 11. All right, so there is no homework assignment underneath these notes. We jump right into genetics day 10. So tomorrow we're going to start looking at how you track these different types of inheritance patterns in a pedigree. So if you wanted to take a look at this ahead of time, feel free, but this is what we're going to do tomorrow. So what I want you guys to do right now is I want everybody to go to Canvas and download the test review. So I'm going to show that where it is for my students. I believe it's in the same place for Mr. Austin's students. So if you go to today's calendar, that's one way to get there. So if you go to the 9th and 8th hour, the genetics test review is here. It's also linked in today's page, so you could go to today's page and get it. If you click on it, you have to click on the PDF here in order to upload this to Notability. So click on the orange link. And then from here, you click this up out of the box arrow, this upload button, and send it to Notability and create new note, which is the second option. And if you have a subject that you call genetics, like I asked you to make at the beginning of this unit, that would be a really good place to put it. And then click import. And there's another review as well. So if you go to modules, at the bottom of the genetics module, like the whole module, there's something called genetic test review materials. I'm gonna eventually put the other test review in here. But what you see here is a copy of the vocab slides that I went over at the beginning of the unit. And then there's another genetics review here. So I would technically get both of these and I would do both of them to get myself ready. But what this is just a 2-page. I used to give a quiz during this unit and this would be the quiz review. So I included it here. I would send that to Notability as well and use it to study. So there is no practice test like there have been for other tests in biology. So this is your practice test. So if you open up the big one that I just gave you called Genetics Review Spring 2021, it's 8 pages long. It's set up like a multiple choice quiz. Number 3 has a typo. This should be C. Somebody just pointed that out at the end of class last hour. And if you scroll down to page 7, that's where questions from today's lecture can be found. So if I were you, if you're like, I feel pretty good about autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive, I'm good to go, Miss Klepper. Make sure that you can then answer these 5 questions about autosomal dominant and recessive. And then lastly, the last thing I want to say is that on the test, you are going to have to do Punnett squares, like number 35. So you're going to want to have a piece of paper and a pencil next to you, either if you're in class taking it or if you're at home taking it. You really should have a piece of scratch paper and a pencil so that you can do these Punnett squares, because you're going to have questions like this where you have to fill in a Punnett square and then answer a question about the offspring. All right, so with that, I know we